let's get started. This is my presentation on community autonomy and dissecting the world religions model. And yeah, let's get into it. So first, I want to talk about imposed categorization from a couple of different angles and how I feel like it does not provide a useful way of looking at religion. So imposed categorization, I kind of define as the categorization of religions based on an outside perspective, which is how the world religions model is pretty much formed. So I want to quote Masuzawa, who kind of views the world religions model as a relic of these imposed Eurocentric hierarchies. She says that there's a possibility that the discourse of world religions, when it finally erupted in the early 20th century, facilitated the conversion of the Euro-hegemonic claim from one context to another. That is, the older discourse of Christian supremacy to the new discourse of world religions couched in the language of pluralism and diversity. And I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about how maybe some of the underlying bias still remains. And then I think the example of Hinduism is especially interesting to look at in post-categorization. We can see how world religions are imposed not just by this like grand Orientalist hegemony, but they're created in a third space, right? So they're created by imposers and imposees. So Richard King talks about in his book Orientalism and the Modern Myth of Hinduism, he says, it's argued that the notion of Hinduism as a single world religion is a 19th century construction, largely dependent upon the Christian presuppositions of the early Western Orientalists. However, this is important, exclusive emphasis upon the role of Western Orientalists constitutes a failure to acknowledge the role played by key indigenous informants, mostly of the Brahmin castes, in the construction of modern notions of the Hindu religion. So yes, the world religion model does hold space for community self-definition, which we'll talk about a lot later, but it's also inherently reductive, and it claims these smaller communities for a grander label. So like when the elite Brahmins claimed many Indian traditions under this kind of unifying but still reductive label of Hinduism. Reductive at the time. Obviously it changes through time, but basically the imposed categorization is still coming from outside of the communities that it's claiming. And then lastly, I think is good context is Mukti Laki Mangaram's in their article Rama Must I Remind You of Your Divinity, kind of talks about like the recalibration of a story, which is important to multiple communities, and it kind of pushes back against what I call tradition claiming, which is like one tradition claiming another community as part of it. So kind of like what the Brahmins were doing with in existing Indian traditions in the creation of Hinduism. And so I think imposed categorization can be adopted by a community, usually for political or social reasons. So like the nation building and social values of the BJP and Hindutva, which I think is interesting. Like the world religions model, it kind of makes this claim on what the nature of Hinduism is. But tradition claiming often occurs without the consent of these communities. So we see in scholarship like Mangaram's, these reductive labels can do real harm to communities that are claimed under them. And then we got to talk about the historical element as well. So Hayden White talks about in his book Historical Fiction, Fictional History, and Historical Reality. He says, in refusing the real, history refuses the possible. A simply true account of the world can provide knowledge of only a very small portion of what reality consists of. But the real consists of everything that can be said about something, even if it didn't necessarily happen. So he makes the separation of truth and reality, truth being like the events that really did happen, and reality is kind of the surrounding context. And he kind of says that historians and the study of history isn't satisfied with just looking at the possible, and they want like the hard facts. They want to know exactly what happened. And he's kind of saying, take a step back. That's a nigh impossible task, and maybe we should be examining the wider context as well. And the world religions model attempts to use these, cold hard facts like who's the founder, when and where were the first communities established, to kind of trace the history of a religion. But as we can see, tracing the history of anything can be really hard, and that applies to religion as well. Also, the academic historical record is not only has a linear concept of time, which isn't adopted by many communities. It follows the meter of like this historical novel, which Pollock talks about as well. But it's also agnostic. It attempts to be measured and treat all sides fairly, which is kind of a relic of what J.Z. Smith was talking about, but it doesn't really allow a lot of wiggle room for traditions that don't fit, or traditions that have an inherently religious view of history. So Sheldon Pollock discusses in his Mimamsa and the Problem of History in Traditional India how history seems to not be so much unknown in Sanskritic India as to be denied, which a lot of people have freaked out about this and made grand accusations about what this means for Indian culture in general, which is, I think, a wild extrapolation. But the cyclicality is just how the religion functions. So Pollock doesn't like the explanation of Hinduism's like has this idea of cyclical time, so that's why they don't do history. But he does say that it connects back to this desire for these teachings to be timeless and transcendent, and shrouding and discarding the historical context. So they have like anonymous writers for a lot of these works, and they minimize historical self-references, serve this purpose. And so using this one-size-fits-all view of history doesn't really work when it comes to traditions like these. And then lastly, we have this conception of history as events occurring upon a linear timeline, which is that linear concept of time we talked about earlier. But there's this idea of history as events and then history as encounters. And so people like Matthew Restall says that there's an encounter model that's not just one-dimensional or even two-dimensional, it's three-dimensional. So you have to look at all these different actors, all the different influences, what was going on in their head. You have to look at it across time to really be able to explain what happens in any given event. And I think that if you use this model, which I like, events, even ones that are happening today, are just too dynamic to really get a whole grasp on. And so if history is concerned with getting at the truth, using an encounter model means that there's just no way to do that, even if we're not looking back in history. And so that kind of ties into this idea of maybe we should lower expectations, which we'll talk about now. How the hell do we even start this project? So I want to talk about the 4 C's model of defining religion. I think it's helpful to our categorization efforts, or lack thereof, and it'll form like the basis of my conclusion. So there's this idea that there are 4 C's in defining religion. So there's creed, which are explanations about the meaning of human life. This includes like scripture, oral histories, paintings, they're affirmations of belief. And then there's code, which is like the doctrine that dictates everyday behavior. These are like moral and ethical systems. And then there are cultists, which is not cults. Cultists is the rituals that are acted out to reinforce the understanding of creating code. So these often engage the body. So think of prayer and meditation and ritual washing. And then lastly is the community. So this is a group of people that are formally or informally connected by a shared creed, code, and cultus. And Albanese, who uses the 4 C's model, kind of gives a working definition of religion. So she says, the system of symbols, creed, code, and cultus, by means of which people, the community, locate themselves in the world with reference to both ordinary and extraordinary powers, meanings, and values, which I like. I think it's a good working definition. But as we'll talk about later, I think the flow of power is flipped here. I think creed, code, and cultus are maybe more arbitrary to the profession of faith than displayed here, and that the flow of meaning comes more from community into the system of symbols rather than vice versa. So let's talk about some parallels, because there are quite a lot of them in Asian religions. So there are a lot of parallels in creed. First off, there's this idea of the monotheistic actor deity that we see in St. Thomas Christianity, in Quralandia, and Islam, which makes sense. They're both Abrahamic religions. I think of the example of St. Thomas's like miracle of freezing water droplets in the air because God was an actor, and then also this like atomistic view in Islam of time as like constant recreations of an existing world. And then there's the idea of suffering and liberation that we see both in Buddhism and Hinduism. You have these like tiers of rebirth, and you have this idea of moksha in Hinduism and nirvana in Buddhism, which are very similar. And then you also have this pervasive and personal divinity, which I see a similarity between Hinduism and Islam. In Islam, you obviously have this idea of like the manifestation and the veil are both Allah. And I mean, this is an idea that not all Muslims share, obviously, because I'm intentionally using the world religions model here, and it's very reductive. This varies person to person. And also in Hinduism, there's this Brahman and Atman connection, where that's like the self is the connection to this divine. If my computer dies, I'll just restart the recording. And then there's also a lot of parallels in code. So we see this like nonviolence that we get in Jainism. You have this extreme nonviolence even against animals. You wear a mask. And also like the vegetarianism, the pacifism, and the lack of killing animals for ritual that we see in Buddhism. And then there's asceticism that we see in the Bhakti movement as well as the Samanas. And obviously there's a lot of overlap between these two groups. But obviously in the Bhakti movement, many poets were ascetics, like by nature. You have Mirabai, you have Mahadevyaka, and then the Samanas are wanderers in India who exited the caste system in favor of this asceticism. Buddha was one of these. And then you have this idea of non-attachment in Chan Buddhism especially, but Buddhism in general, and Taoism. Taoism is a little bit more realist, like focus on realism, but there's still this idea of like emptiness of the self, ridding oneself of desire. And then lastly, there's this attentiveness to ritual that we see in Confucianism, which whether you classify that as a philosophy or a religion, it's just all about, whether you're doing these rituals properly. And then in Hinduism, there's a lot of attention paid to ritual sacrifice in order to bring proper merit. And then we're going to go into cultists. There's a lot of parallels there as well. So first, I see some similarities in kind of this communication of ideas via poetry and prose in Taoism and the Bhakti movement. Obviously, the Bhakti movement is, about poetry. That's how you get your ideas across. But then Taoism, a lot of Taoist stories are related via poetry, or at least prose. The Tao Te Ching is arguably free verse. I feel like there's some discussion about this. I consider it to be so. And then people like Zhuangzi use very colorful anecdotes to relay teachings, which I find to be more poetic than just like, the repeated structure that we get in a lot of other sacred texts. And then you have this meditation. And actually these last two are interesting because cultists, it seems like there's a trend where it's a response to existing traditions, and you're going to get that with this B and C here. So meditation, Chan Buddhism is redefining and reimagining meditation as more than simply sitting meditation, which is what, great vehicle Buddhism, whether that's an imposed label or not, sees it as. So instead of imagining it as just sitting, it's also a meditation of the mind. It's dual with wisdom. It's not just a practice towards moving towards enlightenment. It's it's less of like a cultist and more of like a code of just like, this is how you should be. And then there's sacrifice. So this is another example of the redefinition. In Brahmanism, which is also maybe an imposed category, you have animal sacrifice to gain merit, and Buddhism was like, hey, love your idea of sacrifice. I'm going to appropriate that term, and then I'm going to, substitute tactics. I'm going to like change the ethics of it. I'm going to spiritualize it. I'm going to make it more in line with my code, basically. But I'm going to keep the frame of ritual. And obviously there are more parallels than this, but these are just a couple examples across these 3 first C's. But what about community? And I'm covering my joke. It's not a very funny joke, but it's a joke nonetheless. Well, I get this little battery out here. I feel like with community, obviously you're not going to see a lot of parallels between groups because, you know, it's just like particular people that define themselves as something. So I have a hypothesis. So I think that, so even though we have these parallels between religions in the first 3 C's, using the world religions model, we can say like, oh, this is like this here and this is like this here, which has led a lot of people, myself included, to say like, oh, maybe religions aren't so different from one another after all, and you know, maybe we should not kill each other so much over them. But I feel like going the other way also, we have to think about the differences still, and I think that comes down to the community, and that is the driving force of how we define religion. There are just inconceivable levels of boundaries between groups that we might consider to be parallel, but might define themselves otherly. You know, you have one Baptist church here and then another Baptist church across town. Both of them have groups of 15 people that go to Mass. I'd argue those are, you know, obviously parallel groups, but on some level they're separate communities, even if they're both, you know, the same denomination of Baptist. And I think Susan Viswanathan makes a good point here in her book about the legends of St. Thomas and Kerala. She has this great quote. She says, "The blurring of the lines between groups, as in the rituals of house building or astrology or use of Ayurvedic medicine, is not arbitrary, but a reflection of highly regulated, clearly articulated behavior. And at no point do the marking lines completely disappear. Every group maintains its individuality, aware of similarities with other groups, yet conscious of the points of difference which separate them." And so basically just saying that this inter-community interaction highlights the plurality of religions rather than their sameness. Communities are independent from one another, as we've seen developments in code and cultists, and even to an extent creed, happen in response to other existing communities. But these communities are independent groups. And then lastly, you have Wilfred Cantwell Smith, in his book, The Meaning and End of Religion, in the intro, he says something which kind of makes me laugh, which is that neither religion in general, nor any one of the religions is in itself an intelligible entity, or a valid object of inquiry or of concern either for the scholar or the man of faith. So he's arguing that we should move away from these big questions like, what is whatever religion? What is the nature of it? What is the nature of religion in general? And kind of wants to lower expectations a little bit, kind of what Hayden White is doing with how we go about studying history. And say not only that, you know, we're not going to get these great answers, we're never going to be able to reduce somebody's faith into just a list of properties. But also that scholarship needs to be useful to the people that practice it. It doesn't need to just add something to the historical record or scholarship. It needs to, you know, make sense among the community. And I like that he's looking for answers that satisfy all parties and kind of pushing back against the agnostic hegemony of historical and religious analysis. So here's my plan. Here's my plan to fix religious scholarship. You know, we just talked about autonomous definition. Well, what does that really mean? So I think we need to promote autonomous and not imposed ethnography when we're going about actual on-the-ground study of these religions. So what I mean by that is that ethnography occurs from members of the community and draws on lived and not just observed experience. I don't think you know, observed experience is moot. I think it's still very helpful. But I think we need to really be, you know, empowering these communities to self-define themselves. And if they want to define themselves as part of a broader experience, then that's their prerogative. But the basis is that somebody else isn't doing it for them. And then also we stop categorizing certain communities that don't self-categorize. There are a lot of communities that just don't want to be a part of the historical record or the academic record for whatever reason. And we should respect that as scholars and recognize that there are some places that academia doesn't need to go. Learning about a remote community who doesn't want you there, and writing a paper about it, it's not worth it when you're infringing upon the autonomy of these communities. And then we also need to acknowledge the reductive aspects of this world religions model, which I see as much too broad, and instead focus on the community-sourced understandings of cultist code and creed. So what I was talking about earlier, instead of meaning flowing from those three into the community sort of builds those out. And even when there are parallels in those three with other communities, the communities are what make each practice relevant and autonomous. And then lastly, I think a good way of thinking about religion is that we kind of repurpose Cantwell Smith's model of scripture. He talks about it in The True Meaning of Scripture and Interpretation of the Quran, where he says, whatever it means to practitioners across time and space is what scripture means. And I think that's a very reasonable thing to scale up to this definition of religion is defined as however it is defined by the religious community, which feels like a disappointing answer. It feels almost like a non-answer, but it feels like the answer that it needs to be. Like we said, we're trying to lower our expectations of how we can define religion. And I think we're not going to be able to say for sure from the outside looking in, this is what this religion is. And, if a community says like, oh no, we have the answers, this is what a religion is, then we can go off of that definition, but it can never be imposed. It has to be autonomous. Yeah, so I think when we were finishing off, we were just talking about this kind of my conclusion is that we should scale up Cantwell Smith's model of scripture and just say that religion is defined as however it is defined by the religious community, and accept as religious scholars that there's going to be some level of disappointment with saying that we can't know all the answers ourselves. But I think that's the most ethical and understandable way to do it after having explored the religions of Asia as we have and their history. And yeah, these are the non-reading sources that I used. I obviously used a lot of the sources from the syllabus, but I used Albanese's America, Religions and Religion, which we used in a different class to get the 4C's definition. I also used this talk by Matthew Restall, who's a scholar of Mesoamerican religion and history, talking about encounters and his encounter model as this kind of like 3D space. And then I also talked about Cantwell Smith's introduction in The Meaning and End of Religion, which I found to be a very helpful way of saying, let's take a step back and think about what we as religious scholars are really doing. And that's actually something that we talked about in the, Will brought that reading to us. So yeah, that's my presentation. I know I probably went way over time, but thank you for the extra time and worked really hard on this. So hope it's all right. But yeah, see you in class. Thank you so much.